Okay, we're so excited to have everyone here for our villains panel. We want to welcome everybody from Lit RPG Inland. Like, so excited to have you all here or to discuss in this panel. Um, we have our wonderful authors and narrators here. We have Aaron, Daniel, Brian, and Kale. Brian is one of our amazing ones that decided to pop in the last minute because one of our panelists could not make it. But we're excited to have them here. So I'm gonna let them announce themselves, tell you a little bit about any upcoming projects they might have. So we'll start with Kale.
Oh, okay. um,
I'm a little
Surprise.
I'm a little bit odd. I do things a little bit differently.
oh no, that's fine. I'm Kale Plowman. I have a number of series out. Uh, Viceroy's Pride, Blessed Time, Tower of Somnus, and Dream of Wings and Flame are my two big active ones. Although we'll probably be seeing once I can finally pry some time Viceroy's Pride 4. But well, the problem is I'm looking at my schedule. I'm like booked out 6 months to a year at this point. So I really want to write it. It's just with that. So I write a lot of stuff, fantasy, cultivation, and science fantasy, lit RPG, mostly lit RPG. Frankly, mostly science fantasy. Um, Been a giant nerd forever. Lot of tabletop role playing games and this seemed like the natural progression after my D&D groups couldn't organize anymore. So I'm using the rest of you as my captive audiences so I can actually finish a goddamn campaign.
Okay. We'll move on to Brian then.
Excellent. So this is a little bit surreal for me because being a part of the Lit RPG Authors Guild, I see Aaron's name all the time. Yesterday, I was like gushing on Kale's channel, be like, oh my god,
Yeah.
this is Coco,
Oh
this
my
is
gosh,
fantastic. And Daniel, the first time I ever came across him was yesterday when I was watching the narrators, and I was like, "Holy shit, I love his voice!" And so I was like, so just coming into this room, like, "Oh wow, what are we talking about? Villains?" I was like, "Excellent." So a little bit about me. So I currently work full time. I'm a recruiter for Larian Studios, working on Baldur's Gate 3, which is exciting. I recruit writers, so this is fun. But I have, when I was made redundant, I think a couple of years ago, I said I want to try started writing. And I started writing on Royal Road, a series called Wild Cards, The Dread Pirate. And it got to number 7 on Royal Road before being yeeted back down into the ether. So it was like, oh, you're doing well. Not anymore. 0.5, 0.5. And so that was entertaining. And there's a lot of like inspiration of the people I wanted to kill off from Royal Road. So we'll get to that with villains. But so I was writing that for the last while. Book 1 was done. Did very, very well. It currently has about 900,000 views on Royal Road, doing quite well. And so I'm working on that. But in the last little while, I started working on another series that a lot of the criticisms I got for Wild Cards was like, you're doing VR, because I read Ready Player One and thought to myself, fuck, I could do this better. Which turned into Wild Cards. And when I was doing that, I was like, God, I've learned so much from this that I'd love to actually just give a go to something else. And I said, I'll just write down a few pages. And in 5 weeks, I have 110,000 words done of a magical academy. And I'm like, okay, this has a bit of legs behind it. Let's see how it goes. So just genuinely delighted to be here. You can find me on Royal Road as Brian J. Norton. So
Nice. All
That
right.
brings Dragon Air out.
I'm like a little bit freaking out because Daniel Nowicki is here. Like I'm so excited, but I'll leave that up to you, Daniel.
Oh, cool. Well, I'm very honored to be the main, I guess, narrator in this chat. I'm very honored, especially since I have worked on some of the work from some of the authors in here. Hi, Kale. Very excited to hopefully work on Viceroy's Pride 4. Get on it. But hi, all. I'm Daniel Wisniewski. I've been a narrator since 2019. I love working on lit RPG stuff. It also helps me feel fulfilled due to my D&D groups not being able to match up. That's the true villain. That's the true BBEG of every campaign. Timing and scheduling. That is what it is. But some stuff I've worked on, Viceroy's Pride, Dr. Druid, because it's all Max in the chat. I've also worked on Battleborn. I'm working on Class Shift by Sean Oswald. Book 2 I just finished yesterday. It's on its way to Blackstone right now. And I am the guy who did Dan's Inferno, James Smith. That is me as well. I've also worked in the romance fantasy aspect of it. I've done Towers of Acalia. I've done a lot of the David Burke stuff. But yeah, just a lot of big fantasy things. I am also related to the villains chat here. I work a little bit in video games. I am currently the voice of Charles Dolomar from the Mystery Case File series, if anybody knows that. I took over for that about a year ago, and I just got some lines for the next game. So that's fun. And yeah, just really excited to talk about the best characters to play in every single series ever. So yeah, just excited to be here.
We're glad to have you here. And finally, we have Aaron. I'm like fanboying here because I've read his series and I love his book. So I'll leave it up to Aaron.
Aw, thank you. So yeah, hello everybody. I'm Aaron. I started out writing F3O, which was entirely self-produced, and I love that series. But each book is a very, very big project. And I currently also have 2 series with Aethon. One is the second book's coming out here in about 3 weeks, The Age of Doom. And I have a third one, actually, a third series, second one with Aethon, that I need to get to them Monday. So I'm doing this instead of that.
What are you doing here then?
Procrastinating.
Making our dreams come true.
Like every good artist, you're procrastinating. Well done.
Yeah, exactly. But if any of you have been on Laurel Road and seen a guy named Max Hall, that is me. That is a pen name of mine, and I wrote Humanity's End on there, which I am rewriting and repackaging by Monday for Aethon. So, yay!
Yay!
And that's me. I'm kind of still. I feel new to the author thing. It's been about 2.5 years almost, which it means usually by that point you know what you're doing, and I don't feel like I know what I'm doing. So yay! So that's me. Hello, everyone.
Okay. Well, then we're going to get into it with some of our comments from Discord and from Facebook. One of our first ones is, what intrigues you about villains, and why is there such a following for villains? And I think we'll start with Daniel on that one.
Sure. So,
Thanks,
hi, Max. What intrigues me the most about villains from an acting standpoint usually is that they have the best dialogue. Mm-hmm. They're usually written the best. And it's the most challenging to get into that character's head because, there's that old adage that every villain is the hero of their own story. So why are they doing what they're doing? Like, are they doing it just for evil's sake, for a past wrong? Are they doing it because they feel that they need to be evil to prevent a greater evil? Stuff like that is why I find them so engaging, just because they're inherently more engaging. Because the hero, typically I find heroes, successful ones, are kind of more bland, because then people can see themselves in that light. They can see themselves in that positioning. And villains usually always have an established personality and always usually have an interesting background. Even the simple ones, even evil for evil's sake, can be interesting if they are fun, if they are reveling in what they do. So that's why I love getting into villains' heads because I love that analysis. I love that character study. And I love saying the best stuff in any project because they are always written the best.
And you get that evil laugh every time.
Oh my god, I've had to perfect an evil cackle in like various pitches of my voice, and I love it. Every time I can write something where it's like just this bombastic evil sound is just so much fun. Like I was doing like the villain for Class Shift is this wolf patron god who I just love voicing because I just put him down here and it's very gritty and very monstrous. It's very fun. It's better in the booth when I'm like in the bass mic, not my mic right here, but it's so much fun. But yeah,
that still gives me jitters. Anyways, so we'll continue with Aaron because he was enjoying that.
So so just that first question, how do I get into the mind of a villain and bring them to life?
We're actually doing what intrigues you about villains and why is there such a following for them.
So because personally, it's because how most heroes are written, they're typically not very approachable. Most people can't really see themselves personally actually being a hero. They can connect with aspects of a hero's journey, right? Of the, he wants to do good, he wants to, or she wants to be protective, or she wants to help her family, or whatever it is, right? They can kind of connect with that mission, but the actual character themselves tend to be a little bit hollow compared to their supporting cast, because the supporting cast tends to be more fleshed out and gray. The villain, on the other hand, if done well, the villain tends to be more approachable in general for most people, because it's like, I've screwed up in my life. I've done things I'm not proud of. All of us have. And so we can all kind of connect to that. It's like, I believed one thing when I was younger, and now I believe that thing is wrong. I believed I used to do X, and I realized that wasn't good for me, and now I do Y. So I've improved in my life. But we've all still been at X before. That's where the villain is. We've all been the villain before in our own story, at least to some degree. That's what intrigues me about them.
Gotcha.
Because they're us. We're the villain.
Absolutely. What about you, Brian?
Well, to kind of just add on to what Aaron said there is that what intrigues me about the villains that I write is that they don't see themselves as the villain. They see themselves as the hero of their own story. And it's usually an injustice that has happened to them as adversity that they need to overcome. And that the thing is that in what I wrote in Wildcards was essentially sellout celebrities becoming esports heroes that have no competence in the game, but they're these heroes, and it's all about the brand, the company, the sponsors, everything like that. And they have unintentionally become the villains of their own, of this whole genre. And to combat that, CEO brings in these new players as villains to fight against them, but it's actually the inverse of that. These capable and competent people are going up against the ones that are ruining the game. So for me, what I like to see is that I like to create a villain in such a way that you can be sympathetic to them and that you can see, if only they knew. Like if you saw, like with Cain and Abel by Jeffrey Archer, of the two boys growing up, you know that they would be best friends if they just knew what the other one was going through. But that each of them are sworn enemies and rivals. But you know that, if they had just known this or that. So my villains are usually through misconception. And then they have to go through a kind of a learning process where they are like, oh, fuck, I'm the bad guy. And it's how they react in that moment, because I love the concept of them potentially becoming allies against a future greater threat.
Nice. I like that. What about you, Kale?
So I'm going to probably be mirroring what a lot of people are saying here. But my problem is with writing protagonists is that it's hard to write even anti-heroes. And I would say my 2 active series right now, I have some shade of anti-hero going on. But the problem is when you're writing them, I think it's a little easier, for example, in audio, because you can hear the narrator's inflection when they're talking about it. But when it's just in writing and you're getting screamed at on Royal Road, it's hard for you, if you're trying to inject moral complexity into a character, for that complexity to come across, because it's just in black and white. It's just in writing, and it's easy, especially if someone's reading quickly, for them to miss that complexity. And so part of what I do is, even if there's moral complexity, I have to almost keep it to a minimum so that people can empathize with my main characters, because if I want to have any sort of wide reach with my main character, someone that people can identify with, having scenes where you're something like, holy crap, I can't believe you had this like moment of crisis and did something bad, that's not great. But with villains, I put them into 3 major categories, and I kind of love all of them. You have your cartoon villains that are just like, I'm evil, I'm going to blow up the world because that sounds rad. They're fun to write too, especially if you go over the top with them. The one that's, I think, more common with most people is your morally complex villains. And you have a lot more room to expand on why they're doing something that's evil, and you can explore more of that sort of thought process. But the one that I love the most, and the one that I really like doing with my villains, is what I call the alien villains. I'm going to be honest, I'm probably personally more of like a 60-40 sci-fi to fantasy guy, but the genre is a lot more fantasy, so I kind of trend towards fantasy in my writing, because otherwise the audience is just me. But one of the things that I've always liked is exploring the idea of aliens that are actually aliens. And so I do that a lot with anytime I'm rewriting like goblins or something like that. My goblins aren't going to be your TSR Wizards of the Coast goblins. They're going to be whatever weird idea was in my head when I was writing. And I like the idea of exploring someone with a completely different ethical calculus and a completely different cultural background that leads them to very logical conclusions that are completely different than what you would get for a human. So that's that's kind of what I really like about it. Is I like writing villains that make complete sense, but they are not at all like you or I. And that's really the only chance I have to explore that headspace is through villains, because if I write something completely unapproachable as a protagonist, it's unapproachable. That's kind of the point.
Of course. So we have an excellent question. How do you get into the mind of a villain? Do you use personal experience, or do you draw from people? Well, like what has gotten you into that mindset of the villain, especially coming from a narrative side versus as also an author side of things? So let's start with Brian on this one.
Well, for me, I suppose that it's never really the shock factor. I don't like to go for the easy way. I want to kind of craft and create a personality behind the individual that adds a lot more layers of dimension. So that, as I said before, the relatability that you can feel with them, where you're like, oh, is this person just misunderstood? So with how I kind of craft them, I take my best friends. So I take my best friends and put them in as villains, because I know the layers of their personality. And I know that if that was put within a certain light or a certain instance, then it's very, very possible that they could be very much misinterpreted. And I create those natural interpretations. So for one particular example is that I write within a classist society. And it's all about this underdog going from E-class all the way up, trying to get up the ranks, to, CD, to get through that. Whereas the primary antagonist is C-class, who believes that the person who wronged him has been living this high life. But unfortunately, it's the opposite, in that it actually ruined them and brought them all the way down. So he's going with this entire process and mentality of this person took everything from me, whereas he has no context or idea that it's the opposite. so he's never had the opportunity for empathy. And he is capable of that because he's been living a much better life than the protagonist. So it's that sort of factor of knowing that misconception is his primary driver and focus. Is that's how I get into his head, is like human. Not something, a villain for the sake of being a villain, not a face and the heel. It's more a case of just creating and crafting something where someone could literally turn around and say, like, that's my favorite character, because I understand exactly where they're coming from.
Okay. Let's pop over to Kale on this one.
Can you restate the question? I was halfway through an answer, then I lost my brain.
Yeah. How do you get into the mind of the villain?
Sure.
Do you use personal experiences, or do you draw from people?
Mine is partially drawing from people, and partially there's like a million things going on in my mind at any point in time. One of my greatest regrets is that I feel like at any point in time I have 20 great ideas for novels, and I can barely write one of them at once. But so my thing is, my day job is I am a lawyer, and I work with a lot of people who are not great, and sometimes it's actually great people who are just at really dark moments in their lives. And so a lot of what I will do is take something I see in someone professionally and exaggerate it and morph it into a villain. And so that's a lot of my, especially with morally complex villains. Like one of my favorite villains to write is someone that was just narcissistic to the point where they had like no outside view in. And so that was someone that it's not a lit RPG, so you're probably never going to see it. There's no market for this book, but I love the book. But the character just had no sense of self-reflection, and they're entirely self-focused to the point where I wrote, from their perspective, and you kind of got this view from the inside, but the view from the inside was them not even understanding how someone could conceive of what they were doing as wrong. And because they couldn't conceive of that, they saw opposition as these other people were wrong. So there's a little bit of that, but the rest of it is just, I spend a lot of time daydreaming and theory crafting. And so I come up with, character archetypes that have no relationship whatsoever with what I'm running into day to day. And I'm just kind of like, wow, it would be, cool if I changed 2 or 3 fundamental conceits of a culture, and that's how we ended up with, this evil warlord or whatever. But that's me. I don't know.
So let's hop over to Aaron for that one.
So 2 places typically. First, my background is in political science, history, and psychology, along with government work. So there was a comment basically whenever I who said it? It was whenever I need villains, I just look at U.S. politicians. Partially true. There you go, TJ. Or TL. Yeah, TJ. Yes, that's partially accurate. You can look at like the history, at least for me, you can look at like the history of the US or really any country. You can find villains there. Villains that thought they were heroes, or heroes that thought they were villains, right? And typically, if they're a hero and they think they're a villain, they're probably a hero. But that's a little bit of a different discussion. So that's one place. The other is it kind of comes from psychology, which is this a Jungian theory called the shadow. So if you go through psychoanalysis and therapy, cognitive therapy, at all in your life, with a therapist that is a Jungian, trained in that particular school of thought, then you'll learn to eventually incorporate something they call the shadow, or the shadow self, which is essentially all of the evil that is inside of you, right? All of you that is evil, and then you can incorporate it into yourself, master it, and become, harness that energy for good, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So I think of a. I usually end up starting with just like the backstory of a villain. Like, oh, this is a noble. Like one of my villains is a noble's daughter from some seaside uh, fiefdom in this part of this country, right? And then it's like, okay, what terrible trauma can I inflict on this character to then cause her to become this evil villain that we now experience in the story? Okay, well, she gets kidnapped by a vampire and used as basically a larder for like 20 years of her life.
Gosh.
And then she becomes a necromancer and she learns that the world of light is opposed to her, but the world of all the gods, all
Nice, Joseph Campbell. Love it.
yeah, exactly. And essentially, she learns that the world of light is evil and the world of shadow is good because the shadow came to help her. She ends up learning she's a mage and she's a shadow mage and blah, 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 blah.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, she becomes, in order to protect herself, she becomes this truly evil villain, which is one of the 3 types of villains that I'm personally learning to write, which is the Dark Lord, which is essentially. So you start with a confused hero, which is a hero that has been tricked into doing evil, right? Then that hero eventually becomes a tempted hero, where they have chosen the wrong at least once, and maybe they're still working for the bad guys, but their motives are good, right? Zuko would be at the beginning in Avatar.
Yes, absolutely.
A confused hero at first. Then he becomes a tempted hero. But then he becomes a hero, redeemed hero, or redeemed villain later, right? Azula is straight up just a tempted hero.
Oh yeah.
And by the end of it, she becomes a Dark Lord. Like she starts to embody the evil motivation, the corrupting motivation that started her down that path of power right from the beginning. Like she actually becomes kind of almost like an avatar of that. Instead of instead of incorporating her shadow self, she's let the shadow self become her. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I want to continue on that, but we're going to pop over to Daniel. Changing gears a little bit because he sees things a little bit differently than an author does. How do you, as a narrator, or get into the mind of a villain, and what experiences do you take that give you that dark energy to bring these characters to life?
I like that descriptor. That's fun. Well, thankfully, for 9/10 of the stuff that I've worked on, I've had the privilege of working with gentlemen such as these who put all of that work in before I even get the book. So a lot of the thought is already there in the text and in the actual the subtext and in the descriptors and things of that nature. And usually, I just try to remind myself constantly of what is this character's goal? Why are they doing what they're doing? You know, because they're a villain in the narrative. They're a villain to the protagonist, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they see themselves as that. So how do I do this character justice by being authentic to how they truly feel about themselves? And if that comes across as villainous, that is what it is. It's from the lens of that story. My thing of it is that I never want to do something inauthentic just because there's a stereotypical image of a villain. I never throw in an evil laugh for evil laugh's sake because that can come across as cheesy, and I've been accused and called out for being cheesy. They still bought it. Who cares? But it's fine. I do too. I love it. But my thing is that it's like it should never come across as inauthentic. It can come across as cheesy, that's fine, but as long as it's from an authentic place, then that is what I would prefer. That's what I always try to do with my villains. And it helps to, when I'm thinking of how to craft a voice, anytime it's just with any character's voice, and like adjectives are your best friend in the text, like the description of their bodies, the description of how they sound, what kind of, verbiage they use and things like that. sometimes it does fall into the stereotype, because it's fantasy. A lot of British accents are for villains. But I try to just make sure that it's as authentic to the character that I have been given as possible. Example, because Kale's here, for Viceroy's Pride, in the first book, the mentor character that Mr. Thrush has to, when he's on this foreign planet and is learning all about magic, he is this old sort of hermit scientist, and I could have just easily given him a very, generic, like, snooty academic thing. But for some reason, he struck me as like this Northern English kind of Winterfell type accent. And it was the weirdest choice, but it just felt authentic for this guy who's like isolated and cold and alone and detached. And so
it was the perfect accent for him too.
Oh yeah,
you hit that out of the park.
It turned out perfectly, and I was like, I don't know where this came from, but it's like stuff like that, viewing it and trying to place those kinds of personal choices in the voices and making sure they always read through and that they're always authentically connected with the character itself. So that's what is my main mindset. And also, some are just Joker impressions. Some are Tim Curry impressions. Because these guys, they're their authentic, fun, bombastic self. I do a mean Palpatine, who I've tried to throw into books every so often. But again, those are for the fun, cackly, let's burn it all down villains. So it's still appropriate.
So there was a question on here that I saw that I just loved from Max Farmer. Have you ever had a character that you originally had written as a hero morph into a villain or an anti-hero during your writing or performance? And I want to know. Like, I'm begging to know.
Of course he'd ask that. He knows. It's in Dr. Druid, Max. Of course he did. Anyway, but yes, there is one.
So let's go to Kale for this one.
I've actually had it more go the other way, where I've had more characters I intended to write as irredeemable that have come back and become more of an anti-hero, like supporting character that I have outlines where various characters that my readers love are dead in chapter 13 because I originally intended for them to go that route. But as I wrote them, there was more complexity that came into play while I wrote them. I've had one where I expected there to be more complexity, but as I wrote them, this is the one that I was talking about from the non-lit RPG book that's, it's on Royal Road, but no one reads it. But I had a character that I intended to be sort of this deluded character that was going to get redeemed. And then as I was reading him, I realized, no, he's not, well, he's deluded, but there's no redemption here. He's just going to, full steam ahead, no stops. He's going down this road. So that's the closest I've gotten where I had a character that I intended to be an anti-hero. And I usually don't actually write POVs for villains. And so that's the one time I actually wrote a POV villain, is because he was originally intended to be an anti-hero. And then about 10 chapters in, I'm like, no, this guy's way too fun to write as just, an over-the-top villain. So we're going all the way to the station like that.
Okay, so we'll pop over to Aaron for that question.
Can you repeat it again? It was what?
Have you ever had a character that you originally had written as a hero morph into a villain? And
one. This was the short story. Got to the end of it and I was like, okay, this feels incomplete. I need to leave some kind of hanging thing that kind of tells everybody kind of what happens, but also will lead into further stories. So I was like, okay, well, this character that I wrote, it's in a short story that I just submitted. So I don't want to name too many things.
Complete popcorn. I understand.
Yeah. But essentially, the end, he looks at basically. I'm trying to
yes. No.
He kind of looks at the options in front of him, and he decides. He's surprised when what? Whatever. Okay. So he looks at the options in front of him, and he decides to take an option that provides him great personal fulfillment, but ends up putting the whole planet in danger by basically going through this portal and keeping the portal open. And that's where the lit RPG story starts, is at the other end of this terrible villainous decision. But he's actually a hero. The entire short story, he's fighting these dinosaur invaders from another planet. He's a member of the military. He's this awesome, guy who's gung-ho, there to fight the bad guys and the invaders and all that stuff. And right at the end, makes that decision. So that's the only instance I've done it. But yeah, maybe others can have more information on that one.
I've had a few, just because the variety of the work that I've gotten to do, just because I'm working on multiple different series. I know, with Max's series, Dr. Druid, there are at least 2 characters, and that was fun because one of them, there's an outright evil, because he said it was like good Joker laugh, because there was a Joker character in that book who's like a wonderful necro blood mage, and I just was like, nope, he's just throw it on there. But there is another main character who does, fall down that path. I know with Sibelius's Mountain King saga, the whole point of that is that he becomes the bad guy, and it's like it's more of a character analysis of like how would one become a bad guy in this sort of fantasy world, and what are some things that can really crack a person, and like what can really, like, how far can they bend before they fully snap. It's very dark. It is incredibly dark, but it was intended to be, and so it works. And so diving into that mindset, it could get very heavy to have that happen. And he did start out as kind of at least anti-hero-ish, anti-heroic, but then by the end of it, he's like, nope, I'm the bad guy. Fine, somebody's got to be. Might as well be me. And there was also, I had one. Sort of the flip of it. I just did a book for Podium called Returning to No Applause, Only More of the Same, where it is a character who was transported to a lit RPG fantasy world. He was isekai'd out of his own world, was basically the harbinger of death and destruction for about a century of their time, and then came back only 10 years later as change. And it's more of a PTSD rehabilitation. Can you come back from going too far? How can you reclaim that lost humanity? So I found that fascinating, and I would give that a read or a listen. Available now on Audible. That's one of my favorites.
Great infomercial list.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
No, I'll second that. I read that one on Royal Road, and that one was
so good.
I really like the psychological focus, and that one is a great psychological focus on a villain question mark.
Yeah, I find it easy. It's like I find it interesting that for a series usually will have a hero fall to villainy, but you can usually get the villain to hero in a book if you make that the focus. Like I don't know what it is about that, but I've seen that a couple of times. Like it feels like the story from villain to hero can be done more succinctly than hero to villain.
Oh, absolutely.
So
we'll pop over to Brian, because I don't want to miss out on his comments.
So that is it's really wonderful, because like the answer to the question is no. I've never had a hero morph into a villain. And it's only when Daniel just finished up there is in like, but I have had villains turn into heroes. Because I love similar to Jazz, I see things as scenes, and I want to, the way I create stakes is, okay, I see this event. Why do people care? Okay, let's bring it back. As in like, okay, why are people watching? Okay, bring it back. And then that's how I do things. But when you have characters where the priorities align, the morality decisions are sometimes then skewed. So, for example, if there's a threat that is going to destroy a city, well, the villains live there too. So you have the villains in this moment doing something incredible and heroic that would be perceived as, oh my God, this is such a show of force. This is incredible. and this aligns with what we needed to happen. It doesn't necessarily make them a good person. It's self-preservation. And in their eyes, they're very much doing the, well, you're too fucking weak to do this. So let me show you how it's done, and then we'll go back to absolutely wrecking you. But until then, we're going to deal with this calamity first, and then we're going back to this. And writing that is one of the most fun things, because in those moments of stakes where things are going to go bad, and you just know that...
Answer the question.
Darn
deal.
good question, Jez. Anyway.
I'll deal with you later. Love you all. Fucking dead. Anyway,
Yeah.
so no one does this to me.
Okay.
Anyway,
Okay, we're
sorry.
dropping.
So, but anyway, it's again, it's very much a case of just being able to have those moments, those pinnacle, those pieces. I absolutely love them, especially when you just have them just so focused in on a point where it's a case of, with this one choice, the person I have been fighting all this time could be eradicated, but I know the greater good, or the main priority of finishing this off, I need them alive. And having a villain save a hero in a moment and giving them the condescending of, you're better than this. And that is one of the most powerful things, because it's such a smackdown. And then it's like, what the hell is happening? And it's like, the villain's like, yeah, I got this. I love those moments so
Yeah.
much.
Absolutely.
And actually chiming in on that, one of the most fun things that I've been writing a lot of is having sort of like the main character being tethered to someone who has been established as a villain previously, where there's this uneasy alliance where they can't get away from them because they need their help. But they're borderline a cartoonish villain, but the self-interest is aligning right now. So like half of the book is, they're going to betray me, but when, and when will make the most sense to them. And I don't know, that's just a dynamic I really, really like, of having someone who I hesitate to even call an anti-hero, but you can just have that like push back and forth of the main character being forced to cooperate with someone that is just not a good egg.
Yeah.
Curse your
So-
son, but inevitable betrayal.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
I'm
So I saw an excellent question. Thanks, Geneva, for pointing that out. Jeffrey Martell asked this. What's the difference between a villain who you write for just a single book versus one and who is there for the entire series? How does that dynamic change? Go ahead.
at least from a perspective standpoint, bombacity. They usually get it all out, like everything that they're doing. They're usually like 110, 120% versus the slow burn of over a series. Because you can both from a writing standpoint and a performance standpoint, you can just let it all out because they're not going to come back. So you might as well make an impression, and that's kind of their mentality. Like,
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm gonna burn. Let's all burn together. Let's see how big this fire can get.
And-
So yeah,
What I was going to say on that is functionally the same thing, but from a writing perspective, is pacing. Where the one I'm thinking of right now, basically the first book had one villain that was over the top, one of these, brightly colored cartoon villains. And what it turned out as kind of the reveal is that there had been someone else behind them who was smart enough to put the dumb over the top cartoon person first. And so that's kind of where it built into, is there's this other villain that's going to be here for a long time, but they're smart enough to not put themselves in the line of fire. And that's how you kind of have your evil mastermind type, that, your Moriarty that's going to be there for a long arc, is you have your bombastic villains that they're throwing out there. So you can have your big evil doing something awful, and you can have all your high stakes. But at the end of the day, there's this person that you're going to have a hard time reaching, that you're going to have a hard time interacting with, that's pulling the strings, and they're there, and they're saying, sinister things and steepling their fingers in the background.
Like Robin with Batman.
Yeah,
Distracted.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Powerful distraction.
What about you, Brian?
Oh, sorry.
You're good.
So I suppose it would be, as Kiel said, the pacing. As in, what is it that you need to achieve within this story? What are the stakes involved? Because if you're going to create a villain that's only going to be within a single book, does that mean that they're a stepping stone to something much greater? Like for the challenges to come. So, what sort of personality type is still realistic, relatable, and all of these things within such a constraint? So, typically, what I do is like, if it has to be, I much prefer the long game of a series so that I can flesh out those characters and that some people can turn along the way and that's great. But for this particular one, I suppose it really depends. I think that I wouldn't invest as much into a villain, and it would be much harder to make them much like not cartoony. In the fact, like if they are this insurmountable thing to actually create a realistic threat, then it's not realistic for your primary antagonist to be able to overcome that in such a short space of time. But then if you really lower that level, it's like, well, they're not really that much of a villain, are they? So again, I see them more as antagonists rather than villains. Villains I reserve for something much more nuanced, something that is a lot more meaningful. As you say, the Moriartys of this world. I love the masterminds, the strategics, all of these sort of things, so that you have the multiple machinations in which it's like, oh, you got this person, but that wasn't actually them. And you're like, oh no. So, but also, oh yes. So,
Beautifully done. So, we haven't gotten to Aaron yet, so let's go to him.
So what's the difference between a villain in one book versus multiple, right? I tend to try and write villains. Like if there is a villain, an actual villain that needs to be taken out, as Brian was mentioning, like they need to be big and important, right? So even if they're only alive or in the story for one book, the effects of what they do is going to be through the entire series. For instance, in Ethria, Ethria 1, they kill the necromancer, right? That crazy lady is dead by the end of book 1. But her influence and the things that she's put in motion has affected all the way to book 4. In fact, she might... I'm not going to ruin anything.
No spoilers. No spoilers.
I'm writing that one right now.
Yeah.
But the effects of her, of what she has done in both book 1 and before, basically the hero's been tripping on all of these bombs that she put in place this entire time. Traps, other minor villains she's put in place, her protege at one point, like the evil sorcerer from book 3, and book 2 and book 3, that's her lackey, right? Like her apprentice. So it's like everything that she's done, or everything that he's tripping over when it comes to villainy is attached to her. And even though she's only technically one book. So that's kind of how I feel about, I kind of mirror Brian's view on that. They need to be big and important. Antagonists or like hero versus environment or hero versus self stories don't really have a villain unless the villain is the self. So there's more of an antagonist there than it is a villain. When you have hero versus villain, the villain needs to be big and important.
So this just came to me as I was thinking, because I love the idea of villain turns hero. How often do you guys enjoy that particular idea, to take someone who is so dark and evil and be able to suddenly bring them not fully hero, but right on the edge where they're willing to help?
I can start.
Yeah, go ahead. Hey, Aaron.
What Brian said earlier, when he mentioned it's like, okay, necessity, right? It's like, oh, okay, the Titans from ages past have risen, and it's like, oh, okay, we need to kill that thing, and you're a hero. You're not strong enough to kill that thing. I'm gonna have to kill that thing. And so the villain gets involved and perhaps even tells the hero, "Sit down, child. I'll take care of it." Right? Because in their mind, they're the adult in the room. They're the one willing to do the hard things needing done. And that's one of the reasons why potentially that character fell from being a hero to being a tempted hero, or basically becoming Azuka or Azuma.
Zuko.
Azuma,
Yeah, we know. We know what you meant.
Azula, right? Why Zuko fell in the first place is because he wanted his place, his power, his proper location, which was as prince, right?
Yeah.
He wanted his honor back and all that stuff. Well, that becomes a corrupting desire. And so that villain at one point was a hero. Like all of us, most villains anyway, would be a hero at one point, right? Even Skeletor, the ultimate.
Yeah.
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 He was a hero at one point. He was, at least in one continuity, he was the brother of the king, and he was this epic prince who people looked up to, and was a very intelligent sorcerer scientist, and people really relied on him for a lot of things, and the king leaned on him for things, and then he turned because he wanted the throne, and that desire for power became a corrupting influence rather than a motivation. So yeah,
I actually have
go
a
ahead,
question.
Daniel.
I actually have a question, if that's okay.
Yeah,
Because
go ahead.
I'd like to pick the three of you guys' brains on this.
Yeah.
What do you find more interesting? A villain who comes from greatness, or a villain who comes from anonymity?
ahead.
Brian, hello.
Go ahead, Brian.
Anonymity. A society that has failed them so that they are more nuanced, that they have all these different layers of inconsequence. So what was the trials and tribulations that they had that were outside of the public eye, that are so personal to them, which makes them an enigma for the heroes to never be able to understand or interpret? If they were a public eye, and if they were in the public eye and they had this massive downfall, everyone would have an opinion. Whereas with this, it's like, we don't understand why they are like this, and we will only start to unravel that by slowly getting to know them. And how do we get to know them? Through fighting them, through those monologues, through getting through these things, and then actually studying the history to really just find out about it, to show an interest in them rather than seeing them as a caricature of something that has to be defeated. It's a, why are they like this? And is it actually the society that we've created that is wrong, that produced this person? And you become more sympathetic to them over time. So anonymity all the way.
So I originally would say the same thing, but I found in my last, writing a bit, I've actually been kind of writing, because I like looking at tropes and deconstructing them. And
Mhm.
one of the easiest tropes is small versus big, poor versus rich. And in my last couple books, I've had these rich, socially privileged bad guys. But one of the things that I've actually really enjoyed doing is you start with, my main character is poor, everyone's pooping on them, they're coming into the setting and they're like fighting against this rich privileged person. But I also like having sort of this, there's a lot going on in this like tightly controlled noble structure, like you only know what it's like to be a farm boy, you don't know like the pressures that are being put on being like the third son of a duke who's set to inherit nothing, like that sort of stuff. And so one of the things I actually really like is having this start where it feels like I'm going to hit you with cartoonish evil, and then they're still not necessarily a good person, but it turns into there's a whole lot more going with like their dad's noble rival, or like inter-family structures and stuff like that. So like I really do like both, but I really also like exposing sort of the bait and switch on it. You come in with the cartoonish evil where it's like, of course, this is the local prince's son, and he's a jerk for the first 5 chapters. Of course he's going to be the bad guy. And then you can pull it back and be like, anyway, here's why they're a jerk, and I'm going to make you care about them before I do and eventually kill them. They're still going to die.
Okay. And this will be the final thing for Aaron.
Okay. Let's see. anonymity versus what was it?
Greatness versus
Greatness
anonymity. Like an established or
So we had one extreme and the other extreme. I'm going to say both.
Yeah.
I've written characters, main characters from both perspectives, and I think there's a really good story in both. It just depends on execution.
Absolutely. Okay. We're basically at the end of our panel, guys. We've had a ton of comments begging you guys is for links to each of your books. So I know we can't, and I know we can't ask you guys to ask what your upcoming projects are, but would you please link these things in the Discord chat, and we'll continue this in Discord right after. But we are so grateful for the time that you guys have taken. This was an awesome discussion, and I'm so glad Brian was able to join us.
Yeah.
Like this was awesome. Before we close, we've had one request that has been begged. Can we get an evil laugh
From Daniel. Oh,
for me?
Daniel
yeah.
or for Brian?
Absolutely,
No,
Daniel.
all
On
of
our-
them.
From our amazing.
I've already given mine.
Well, what kind do you want? Do you want like a deep foreboding chuckle, like a Gary Oldman Dracula, or do we want like a Joker cackle?
All I know is they've begged for an evil laugh.
All right. See, it usually takes me 4 or 5 tries in the booth. It's not
Oh,
not
yeah.
a one and done, people.
Oh yeah, of course.
Editing is a joy. So it's just, usually I'm just like, if I'm getting into it, it's just like we start with the Gary Oldman like and then it can build up to and then also the Joker went up.
Beautifully done. I love it.
Done.
I'm on board.
Oh, that makes me happy so much. Thank you so much, guys, and we'll continue this in the Discord chat. So, thanks. This was beautiful.
This was
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
All the best. Thanks so much.